What if I told you that everything you've been chasing, everything you've been trying to manifest for years, could shift after a single moment of understanding? Not after months of affirmations, not after endless visualization sessions, not after forcing yourself to believe something you don't actually feel, but after one real listening. I know how dangerous that sounds. It almost feels irresponsible to say it out loud, because once you hear this, once it actually lands, there's no going back to trying the old way. And that's exactly why this video is dangerous. A few months ago, I wasn't feeling powerful, I wasn't aligned, I wasn't in the vortex. I was tired, mentally exhausted, burned out from trying to fix my life using every method I had been told would work. I had read the books. I knew the quotes. I understood the concepts intellectually. And yet, nothing was changing. The more I tried to apply the teachings, the more frustrated I became. It felt like I was doing everything right, and life was doing nothing in return. And then something happened that completely changed my understanding of how this works. Not during meditation, not during prayer, not during some spiritual ritual. It happened in the most ordinary moment imaginable. A moment so unremarkable that I almost missed it entirely. But that moment revealed a truth so simple, so precise, that it collapsed years of effort into a single realization. Within days, things that had been frozen for months started moving. Conversations shifted. Opportunities appeared without effort. Situations resolved themselves in ways I could not have planned even if I tried. And the most unsettling part wasn't what changed outside of me. It was the realization of why it hadn't worked before. Because the problem was never that I didn't know enough. It was that I was trying. Most people never question this. They assume effort is the answer. If something isn't working, you do more. You repeat the affirmation louder. You visualize longer. You discipline your mind harder. You force yourself into belief. And if results don't come, you blame yourself for not being consistent enough, not pure enough, not advanced enough. But what if the effort itself is the blockage? There's a principle that almost nobody understands, even though it's been hiding in plain sight the entire time. The harder you try to force an internal state, the more you activate resistance. Not because you're doing something wrong, but because effort implies absence, strain implies lack, trying implies that what you want is not already yours. Your subconscious mind doesn't respond to what you want. It responds to what you accept as true. And this is where everything flips. At some point, without intending to, I stopped trying to make anything happen. Not in a defeated way, not in a hopeless way, but in a way that felt like setting something heavy down after carrying it for too long. I didn't affirm. I didn't visualize. I didn't correct my thoughts. I simply stopped managing the process, and in that stillness something locked into place. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't dramatic. There were no fireworks. It felt quiet, neutral, almost boring. But beneath that calm was something different. A sense that nothing needed to be done. A knowing that didn't need reassurance. A state that didn't need effort to maintain itself. That was the moment everything shifted. Here's the part most people miss. The subconscious mind is not convinced by repetition. It is convinced by acceptance. The moment something feels natural, familiar and real to you, the subconscious treats it as fact. And the moment it accepts something as fact, it immediately begins reorganizing your external world to reflect that assumption, not because the universe is rewarding you, not because you earned it, but because that's how the mechanism works. The reason this is dangerous is because it removes struggle from the equation entirely. And for many people, struggle has become part of their identity. They don't just want results. They want to feel like they're doing something to deserve them. But the subconscious doesn't operate on deserving. It operates on alignment. Think about how many things in your life you never tried to manifest, yet they showed up effortlessly. Your habits, your patterns, your default reactions, your current circumstances, all of them came from unconscious acceptance, not from effort. You didn't try to believe them. You didn't work to maintain them. You simply lived from them. That's the part that changes everything. Most people are approaching manifestation from the outside in. They're trying to change reality in order to feel different. But the actual mechanism works in reverse. You change your internal state, and reality has no choice but to follow. But here's the part that almost nobody tells you. You cannot force a state. You cannot effort your way into acceptance. You cannot strain your way into knowing. The moment you try to make yourself believe, you're already contradicting yourself, because belief doesn't require effort. Certainty doesn't need repetition. Knowing doesn't need proof. This is why so many people burn out. They're using techniques designed to reinforce a state of having, but they're doing them from a state of not having. And the subconscious only hears the state, not the words. It's like pressing the gas pedal while the parking brake is on. The engine revs, the effort increases, but movement doesn't happen. And eventually, you assume something is broken. Nothing is broken. You're just operating from the wrong level. The moment I stopped trying to impress my subconscious and allowed myself to rest in the assumption that it was already done, something clicked. And I don't mean pretending. I don't mean positive thinking. I mean the absence of urgency, the absence of waiting, the absence of internal negotiation. It felt like being done. And when you're done, you don't look for signs, you don't check for evidence. You don't wonder if it's working, because those behaviors belong to someone who is still waiting. This is where most people sabotage themselves. They have a moment of clarity, a brief shift in state, and then immediately they look outside themselves to confirm it. They check their bank account. They refresh their email. They scan their environment for proof. And in doing so, they step right back into the identity of not having. The subconscious registers that immediately, and the old pattern resumes. This is why the shift has to be internal and complete. Not perfect, not dramatic. Just real. The state that creates everything is not excitement. It's not enthusiasm. It's not emotional intensity. It's calm certainty. The kind of certainty that doesn't need reinforcement. The kind of certainty that doesn't announce itself. The kind of certainty that feels almost boring because there's nothing left to do. That's the state that actually moves reality. And here's the part that might make you uncomfortable. You've already experienced this state before. Many times. Just not in areas you consciously chose. Think about things you don't question. Things you assume without effort. Your name, your age, your past. Certain limitations you believe are just the way things are. You don't affirm those. You don't visualize them. You don't try to believe them. You simply accept them. And because you accept them, your reality continuously confirms them. The same mechanism applies to everything else. There is no special category for money, love, health, or success. The subconscious doesn't rank desires. It responds equally to all assumptions. The only difference between what you have and what you want is the level of naturalness you feel toward it. That's it. And this is where everything changes, because it means you don't need to add anything to yourself. You don't need more discipline. You don't need better techniques. You don't need stronger belief. You need subtraction. You need to remove the internal resistance created by trying. The most powerful state is not effort. It's allowance, not passive resignation, not giving up on life, but giving up the internal fight. The moment you stop trying to control the process begins to work. This is why one real listening can be enough. Not because the words are magic, but because understanding collapses effort. When something truly clicks, you don't have to remind yourself of it. It becomes obvious. And what becomes obvious no longer requires maintenance. That's what happened to me. And that's why this works so fast when it works. Time delay doesn't come from the universe being slow. It comes from internal contradiction. When you say you want something, but your state says you don't have it, the subconscious follows the state. When your state shifts to ownership, even quietly, even without emotion, reality reorganizes itself automatically. And it does not do so in dramatic ways. It does not announce itself. It does not arrive with a sign that says, "This is your manifestation." It arrives as a conversation, a decision, a change of timing, a shift in someone else's behavior, a door that was closed and is suddenly open. And because it feels natural, you almost miss it. That's how you know it's real. The person who has what they want does not feel surprised by life aligning. They expect it. An expectation is just another word for assumption. This is why the idea of manifesting eventually dissolves for people who truly understand it. It stops being something you do and becomes something you live from. You stop asking, "How do I get this?" and start asking, "Who am I being right now?" Because identity is the real lever. You don't attract what you want. You attract what matches your self-concept. If you see yourself as someone who struggles, you will unconsciously recreate struggle. Not because you want to suffer, but because the subconscious seeks consistency. If you see yourself as someone who has to try hard to get anything, life will keep presenting situations that require effort. If you see yourself as someone who is supported, provided for, and aligned, your reality will begin reflecting that assumption in ways that feel almost effortless. And here's the most confronting part. You cannot wait for circumstances to change before you change your identity. That's backwards. Identity comes first, state comes first, reality follows. This is where responsibility enters the picture, and this is where many people turn away. Because if your reality is a reflection of your internal state, then blame has nowhere to land, not on your past, not on other people, not on the economy, not on bad luck. And while that might feel heavy at first, it is the most freeing realization possible, because it means nothing outside of you has power over your experience. The moment you truly accept a new state, your subconscious does the rest. You don't need to manage the how. You don't need to visualize steps. You don't need to force action. Action will arise naturally from the new identity. The right decisions will feel obvious. The right conversations will happen without planning. The right opportunities will stand out without effort. This is why forcing action from the wrong state never works long term. You might get temporary results, but they collapse because they don't match who you believe yourself to be. When identity changes, behavior changes automatically. And when behavior changes, outcomes must follow. This is not philosophy. This is observable. Look at people whose lives seem to flow. They're not working harder than everyone else. They're operating from a different internal baseline. They expect things to work out. They assume support. They trust timing. And because those assumptions are unconscious, reality continuously confirms them. The danger of this understanding is that it removes excuses. You can't unknow that you've been using this mechanism your entire life. You've just been using it unconsciously. Every limitation you experience is the result of an accepted assumption. And every expansion begins the moment a new assumption feels natural. The good news is that you don't need to fight old beliefs. You don't need to argue with them. You don't need to suppress them. You simply need to stop feeding them with effort. When you relax, the subconscious becomes receptive. When the body softens, the mind opens. When urgency drops, resistance dissolves. This is why relaxation is not a side note. It's the gateway. A tense body cannot accept a new state. A mind in survival mode cannot receive abundance. Peace is not the reward. Peace is the entry point. The moment you settle into yourself, the moment you stop trying to fix the present, the moment you stop negotiating with the future, something fundamental shifts. You stop living in anticipation. You stop living in hope. You stop living in preparation. And you start living from possession, not emotionally, not theatrically, internally. This is why one real listening can change everything. Because it's not about learning something new. It's about seeing clearly. Once you see that effort has been the block, effort falls away naturally. Once you see that the subconscious responds to state, not words, techniques lose their grip on you. Once you see that identity precedes experience, you stop waiting for permission. And once you stop waiting, life starts moving. Not because you forced it, but because you finally got out of the way. This is not about getting everything you want in a literal sense. It's about aligning with the version of you for whom things work. And when you live from that place, wanting becomes irrelevant, because wanting belongs to someone who doesn't have. And the moment you stop wanting, having begins. That's the real secret, not effort, not repetition, not discipline. Understanding, and understanding when it's real, only needs to happen once. Understanding doesn't shout, it doesn't demand your attention, it doesn't arrive with urgency. Real understanding feels quiet, almost anticlimactic. That's how you know it's real. It doesn't excite the mind, it settles it. And once the mind settles, the subconscious finally has room to do its work. Most people never reach this point because they mistake intensity for truth. They believe that if something is real, it must feel powerful, emotional, overwhelming, but the deepest shifts rarely feel dramatic. They feel obvious. They feel like remembering something you always knew but somehow forgot. And that's exactly what this is, a remembering. You were never meant to struggle your way into alignment. You were never meant to wrestle your thoughts into submission. You were never meant to exhaust yourself trying to control an invisible process. That entire approach came from misunderstanding how the mind actually works. The subconscious is not impressed by force. It yields to familiarity. Whatever feels normal to you, whatever feels like this is just how things are, becomes the blueprint your life organizes itself around. Not because you chose it deliberately, but because you accepted it quietly. This is why the idea of getting everything you want is misleading. You don't get it, you allow it. And allowance is not an action, it's the absence of interference. The moment you stop interfering with your own internal state, the system corrects itself. Think about how many times you've tried to fix your thoughts. You notice a negative thought and immediately try to replace it. You catch yourself feeling doubtful and force positivity. You monitor yourself constantly, afraid that one wrong thought will ruin everything. That constant self-monitoring is not awareness, it's anxiety. And anxiety is one of the strongest signals of lack you can send to the subconscious. Not because anxiety is bad, but because it carries a message something is wrong, something is missing, something needs to change before I can relax. The subconscious hears that clearly, and it responds faithfully. It keeps you in situations that justify the anxiety. This is why trying to stay positive often backfires. You're not addressing the state underneath. You're just putting new language on top of the same identity. The shift happens when the need to manage disappears, when you no longer feel responsible for making things happen, when you no longer feel like your future depends on constant effort. That's when your system recalibrates. The subconscious is incredibly efficient. It doesn't need instructions. It needs direction. And direction comes from identity, not intention. Who you believe yourself to be determines what feels possible. What feels possible determines what you allow yourself to notice. What you notice determines the actions you take without thinking. And those actions create results that look like coincidence to anyone who doesn't understand the mechanism. This is why people often say, "It just worked out," without being able to explain how. It worked out because they stopped interfering. They weren't trying to manifest. They weren't managing outcomes. They weren't waiting for proof. They were simply living from a different internal baseline. And that baseline does all the work. The reason one listening can be enough is because the moment the internal contradiction dissolves, there is nothing left to fix. You don't need to reinforce truth. Truth sustains itself. Falsehood requires maintenance. That's why limiting beliefs feel heavy. They require constant confirmation. They need repeated evidence. They need stories to survive. Truth feels light. It doesn't need support. Once you see this, you stop chasing methods. You stop asking which technique works best. You stop comparing approaches, because you realize the technique was never the source of power. You were, and not in an egoic way, in a mechanical way. Your state is the signal. Your nervous system is the transmitter. Your subconscious is the receiver. And your reality is the output. Change the signal, and the output must change. Not eventually, immediately. The delay you perceive is not delay at all. It's reorganization. Just like planting a seed doesn't look like growth at first, internal shifts don't announce themselves externally right away. But something is always happening beneath the surface. The problem is that most people dig up the seed to check if it's working. They doubt, they worry, they interfere, and in doing so, they return to the old signal. The moment you stop checking, things accelerate. This is not because checking is bad. It's because checking implies uncertainty, and uncertainty is a state. The subconscious does not respond to what you say you believe. It responds to what your behavior reveals you believe. If you constantly look for proof, you believe you don't have it yet. If you constantly wait for confirmation, you believe it's not done. If you constantly analyze results, you believe you're still in control of the process. And control is another form of effort. Effort is not required once the assumption is accepted. This is why the feeling of already done is so powerful. Not excitement, not relief, not gratitude, just unfinished, settled. There is no urgency in done. There is no fear in done. There is no anticipation in done. There is peace, and peace is the natural state in which creation flows. Most people are afraid of this because they confuse peace with passivity. They think if they relax, nothing will happen. But the opposite is true. When you relax, everything happens. Because action that arises from alignment is effortless. You don't force it. You don't overthink it. You don't second-guess it. You simply move when it feels natural to move, and those movements are precise. They are timed. They are effective. This is why people who operate from the right state often appear lucky. They're not luckier. They're less resistant. They're not pushing against life. They're cooperating with it, and cooperation is not something you do. It's something you stop not doing. The mind loves complexity. It loves steps, rules, systems. It feels safe when it's busy, but the subconscious responds to simplicity. It responds to coherence. When your thoughts, feelings, and identity align, there is nothing to correct, no friction, no delay, just movement. This is why trying to manifest from fear never works. Fear is incoherent with abundance. Trying to manifest from desperation never works. Desperation signals lack. Trying to manifest from force never works. Force signals opposition. The only state that creates effortlessly is acceptance, and acceptance cannot be faked. It arrives naturally when understanding replaces effort. Once this clicks, you'll notice something subtle. Your desire loses urgency, not because you don't want it anymore, but because you no longer need it to validate you. You're no longer using the future to fix the present. You're no longer saying, once this happens, I'll be okay. You're okay now? And that's when everything changes, because reality reflects who you are, not what you're waiting for. This is the part people misunderstand. They think they need to feel happy all the time. They don't. They think they need to suppress negative emotions. They don't. They think they need to maintain a high vibration. They don't. They need one thing: internal consistency. If you feel sad, feel sad. If you feel tired, but don't add the story that something is wrong. Don't add the meaning that you're failing. Don't add the assumption that this emotion blocks your future, because those assumptions are states. Emotions pass, states persist. You can feel anything and still live from certainty. You can experience discomfort and still know it's done. You can face challenges and still operate from identity. This is maturity. This is grounded power. This is what Joseph Murphy was pointing to beneath the language. He wasn't teaching people how to get things. He was teaching them how to stop sabotaging the mechanism that was already working. Your subconscious is always creating. The question is, from which assumption? Once you see that, you stop chasing outcomes, you stop obsessing over timelines, you stop measuring progress, because measurement implies doubt. You move differently, you speak differently, you decide differently, and the world responds differently. Not because you changed the world, but because you changed the lens through which you experience it. The lens determines everything. Two people can be in the same situation and experience completely different realities. One feels trapped. The other sees opportunity. One feels threatened. The other feels curious. One feels powerless. The other feels calm. The situation didn't change. The state did. And state always wins. This is why one real listening can alter the trajectory of your entire life. Not because it gives you power, but because it reveals the power you've been using unconsciously. Once revealed, it can't be unseen. You can still choose to struggle, but you'll know you're choosing it. You can still choose effort. but you'll feel when it's unnecessary. You can still chase, but it will feel unnatural. And eventually, you'll stop, because there's no satisfaction in fighting something that no longer feels real. You'll notice that life begins to meet you halfway, not dramatically, subtly, quietly, in ways that feel obvious in hindsight. You'll look back and realize that the moment everything changed wasn't when something arrived. It was when you stopped needing it to. That's the moment the signal changed. And once the signal changes, the system responds, always, without exception. This isn't about belief. Belief is effort. This is about knowing. And knowing is effortless. Once you know something, you don't need to remind yourself. You don't need reinforcement. You don't need proof. You simply live, and life reorganizes around that knowing. That's why this video is dangerous. Because if this lands, if you truly hear it, you can't go back to pretending the old way works. You can't unknow that effort was the interference. You can't unknow that identity precedes experience. You can't unknow that peace is the gateway. And once you know that, the only thing left to do is allow, not tomorrow, not when conditions change, now, because the present moment is the only place identity exists, and the present moment is where everything begins. That's it. Nothing to add, nothing to force, nothing to repeat. Just a quiet shift. And everything follows. When you truly understand this, something subtle but profound happens. You stop looking at your life as a problem to solve. You stop treating every delay as a failure and every obstacle as a sign you're doing something wrong. You begin to see your experience as feedback, not judgment. And feedback is neutral. It doesn't punish, it informs. Most people never allow themselves to stay in that neutrality. The moment something doesn't work out, they rush to meaning. They tell themselves a story. This proves it's not working. This means I don't believe enough. This means I need to try harder. And with that single interpretation, they collapse back into the old state. Not because the setback was real, but because the identity behind the interpretation was. Here's something that's rarely said clearly. The subconscious does not react to events. It reacts to meaning. Two people can experience the exact same circumstance, and one uses it as confirmation of success, while the other uses it as evidence of failure. The difference is not the event. It's the assumption they're living from. This is why maintaining the state is not about suppressing reactions. It's about choosing the meaning you assign. And the version of you who already has what they want assigns meaning very differently. They don't ask, why isn't it here yet? They ask, what's being rearranged? They don't say, this is proof it's not working. They say, this is part of the process. They don't feel urgency. They feel inevitability. Inevitable things don't require stress. You don't stress about the sun rising tomorrow. You don't worry whether gravity will stop working. You don't feel anxious about whether your name will still be your name next week. Those are givens. They're assumed, and because they're assumed, they're stable. Your desires can occupy that same category, not by force, not by repetition, but by acceptance. This is the part that changes your relationship with time. When you're living from the end, time stops feeling like an enemy. You're no longer racing against it. You're no longer watching the clock. You're no longer counting days, weeks, months. Waiting disappears. And when waiting disappears, resistance disappears with it. Waiting is a state. Anticipation is a state. Hope is a state, and all of them imply not having. The moment you step out of those states, the signal changes. This doesn't mean life becomes perfect overnight. It means your internal stability no longer depends on outcomes. And that stability is what allows outcomes to shift. Paradoxically, the less you need things to change, the faster they do. This is not spiritual poetry, it's psychological mechanics. Needing creates tension. Tension creates contraction. Contraction limits perception. Limited perception limits options. And limited options reinforce the original need. That loop is what most people are stuck in. When the need drops, the loop breaks. Your perception widens. You notice opportunities you were blind to. You respond instead of react. You choose instead of default. And those small shifts compound rapidly. This is why results often appear suddenly, even though the internal shift happened quietly days or weeks earlier. From the outside, it looks like magic. From the inside, it feels inevitable. You didn't make it happen. You allowed it to happen. And allowance is not passive. It's precise. It means you stop injecting fear into neutral moments. You stop assuming delays are denials. You stop reading rejection into silence. You stop turning uncertainty into threat. You let life move without constantly interrupting it with your interpretations. This is especially important when nothing seems to be happening. That's the test. When you've shifted internally but the external hasn't caught up yet, that's when the old identity tries to reclaim control. It whispers, "See, nothing changed. You're fooling yourself. You need to do something." And if you listen to that voice, you step right back into effort. But if you recognize it for what it is, conditioning, habit, old wiring, and you don't react, it loses power. Not because you fought it, but because you didn't feed it. Old states survive on attention, withdraw attention, and they dissolve. This is why peace is so threatening to the old identity. The identity built on struggle needs problems to justify itself. When things feel calm, it panics. It looks for something to fix, something to worry about, something to improve. Learning to sit in calm without interfering is a skill, and it's the only one that matters. Because calm is the state of trust, and trust is not belief. Trust is not optimism. Trust is relaxed certainty. It's the feeling that even if you don't see the whole picture, nothing is wrong. Once that becomes familiar, the subconscious locks onto it as the new baseline. And when the baseline changes, everything built on it must change too. This is why your environment starts responding differently without you doing anything consciously. People treat you differently. Situations resolve faster. You feel guided without knowing why. You didn't become more worthy. You became more coherent. Your internal signals stopped contradicting each other, and coherence is power. The danger of this realization is that it removes drama, and drama is addictive. Many people unconsciously use struggle to feel alive. They don't know who they'd be without something to fix. But the version of you who has everything you want is not dramatic. They're grounded, they're present. They're simple. They don't wake up trying to manifest. They wake up living. And living from the right state does more than any technique ever could. This is why after one real listening, people often feel disoriented, not euphoric, disoriented, because the old rules stop applying, but the new ones are simpler than expected. You keep waiting for instructions. There are none. You keep looking for steps. There aren't any. You keep asking what to do next. There is nothing to do next. Just remain. Remain in the assumption. Remain in the calm. Remain in the knowing. And let life catch up, because it always does. The moment you stop chasing the future moves toward you. The moment you stop proving yourself, opportunities recognize you. The moment you stop trying to deserve, you become available to receive. This is not about being special. It's about being aligned. Alignment is quiet. Alignment is subtle. Alignment doesn't advertise itself, but it is unstoppable. Once you're aligned, things cannot help but work out because there is no longer an internal argument against them. No resistance, no friction, no mixed signal, just clarity. And clarity reorganizes everything. That's why this works after one real listening. Not because the video has power, but because understanding removes interference. And once interference is gone, the mechanism you've been using your entire life finally works in your favor. From that point on, it's not about getting everything you want. It's about realizing you were never separate from it in the first place. You don't cross a bridge. You stop imagining the gap, and when the gap disappears, there is nothing left to travel, only to live. From here, life stops feeling like something you're chasing and starts feeling like something that's responding. Not responding to your words, not responding to your rituals, responding to who you are being when no one is watching. This is where the shift becomes undeniable. You begin to notice that your reactions soften. Situations that would have triggered anxiety before now feel neutral. Problems that once felt heavy no longer hook into you the same way. And that's not because the problems disappeared. It's because the identity that needed to struggle with them did. When the internal pressure drops, the external pressure follows. Always. This is why forcing yourself to stay in a high state never works. High states collapse. They require energy. They need maintenance. Calm certainty doesn't. It's stable, sustainable. It doesn't fluctuate with circumstances. The subconscious loves stability. Whatever feels stable becomes real. So when you stabilize in the feeling of already having, already being, already supported, the subconscious locks that in as the new truth. And from that truth, it generates behavior, perception, timing, and opportunity that match it. This is why people who truly shift don't feel like they're manifesting anymore. They feel like life is cooperating with them. And cooperation is not dramatic, it's efficient. Things happen with less friction. Delays shorten. Detours become useful. What once felt like resistance turns into redirection. And the most surprising part is how normal it all feels. There's no moment where you stand back and say, "It worked." There's just a quiet realization one day that you're no longer living from the same place. Your concerns have changed. Your questions have changed. Your internal dialogue has changed. And because of that, your results have changed. This is the moment where people often ask, "How do I make sure I don't lose this?" And that question reveals the last layer of misunderstanding. You don't hold this state. You don't protect it. You don't cling to it. Clinging is fear. Fear signals loss. Loss reactivates effort. Instead, you live. You respond honestly to what's in front of you. You let emotions move without turning them into stories. You take action when it feels natural. You rest when it feels natural. And you trust that the system is self-correcting. Because it is. The subconscious is not fragile. It doesn't need micromanagement. It doesn't fall apart if you have a bad day. It doesn't undo itself because you felt doubt for a moment. What matters is the baseline you return to. And once understanding has truly landed, the baseline shifts automatically. You might still think old thoughts, but they don't carry the same weight. You might still feel uncertainty, but it doesn't define you. You might still face challenges, but they don't threaten your identity. And identity is the only thing that ever mattered. This is why you can't unhear this once you really hear it. You can still choose to live the old way, but it will feel unnatural. Effort will feel heavy. Trying will feel forced. Waiting will feel pointless, because now you know the difference between movement and struggle. Movement flows, struggle resists, and life responds to flow. The final shift is subtle but permanent. You stop asking whether things will work out. That question dissolves. It no longer makes sense. Instead, you move with the quiet assumption that whatever unfolds is part of the rearrangement. Not because everything is perfect, but because nothing is wrong. And when nothing is wrong internally, reality has no reason to stay stuck externally. This is where patience becomes effortless. Not because you're waiting, but because you're already there. Time no longer feels like something separating you from your life. It feels like something carrying you through it. This is what it means to live from the end, not pre-imagining, not convincing, being, and being is enough. Once you understand this, the question is no longer how to get everything you want. The question dissolves, because you realize wanting was never the issue. Trying was, and the moment trying ends, the system does what it was always designed to do. It delivers, quietly, naturally, inevitably. And from that point on, life doesn't need to be controlled. It needs to be trusted, because it's already responding, right now. And here's the moment where everything finally settles into place. You realize that nothing is missing, not in a philosophical way, not in a motivational way, in a practical, grounded sense, the sense that you are no longer oriented toward lack. You're no longer scanning the horizon for something to arrive so you can finally begin living. You are already living, and life responds to that immediately. This is where people often misunderstand what already done truly means. They think it's about imagining a future outcome so vividly that it feels real. But that still places fulfillment in the future. That still centers your awareness on arrival. The state that creates is not arrival. It's ownership. Ownership has no tension in it. Ownership has no urgency. Ownership doesn't rehearse or reheal or reimagine. Ownership simply operates. When something is yours, you don't think about it all day. You don't wonder if it will disappear. You don't constantly check on it. It fades into the background of your awareness and becomes part of who you are. That's the state your subconscious responds to most powerfully. Not obsession, not desire, not effort, normalcy. When your desire feels normal, it becomes inevitable. And this is why the biggest breakthroughs often happen when people stop caring so much. Not because they gave up on life, but because they stopped using outcomes to regulate their sense of self. They stopped saying, "Once this happens, I'll be okay," and started being okay now. That single shift removes enormous pressure from the system. Pressure distorts. Ease clarifies. When you're at ease, you see clearly. And when you see clearly, you move accurately. Accuracy beats effort every time. This is why action that comes from alignment feels obvious in hindsight. You don't agonize over decisions. You don't overthink next steps. You just know what to do or what not to do. And that knowing doesn't come from thinking harder. It comes from being quieter. The mind is loud when it's afraid. It's quiet when it trusts. Trust is not something you force. It's something that emerges when you stop contradicting yourself internally. The contradiction most people live in is simple. They want certainty, but they keep acting like they don't have it. They want abundance, but they keep reinforcing scarcity through worry. They want love, but they keep scanning for rejection. They want freedom, but they keep identifying as trapped. None of this is wrong. It's learned. But once you see it, you can't unsee it. And once you stop reinforcing it, it dissolves on its own. This is why the most powerful change doesn't feel like effort. It feels like relief. Relief that you no longer have to manage everything. Relief that you no longer have to prove anything. Relief that you no longer have to fight yourself. And in that relief, the subconscious finally has clear instructions, not spoken, felt, accepted. From that point on, life begins to mirror the new assumption without asking your permission. It doesn't wait for you to feel ready. It doesn't wait for you to understand everything. It responds immediately to coherence. That's why results often come faster than expected once the shift is real. Not because you accelerated time, but because you removed resistance. Resistance is what makes things feel slow. When resistance drops, momentum returns. And momentum doesn't feel like pushing. It feels like being carried. This is the stage where people often say, "I don't know why, but things just started working." They do know why. They just didn't see the shift happen because it wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, internal, subtle. But once it happened, everything else followed. This is also where comparison disappears. You stop measuring your life against other people's timelines. You stop asking whether you're behind or ahead. Those concepts lose meaning. You're no longer racing anyone. You're no longer proving anything. You're no longer late. You're exactly where you need to be because your internal state matches where you're standing. And when state and position align, progress feels natural. This is the danger of this understanding. Not that it gives you false hope, but that it removes the need for hope entirely. Hope belongs to someone who doesn't have. Knowing belongs to someone who does. Once you move into knowing, the old motivational language stops working on you. Fear-based urgency stops motivating you. External pressure loses its grip. You begin to operate from a deeper place, a quieter place, a place where decisions are simpler because they're no longer driven by panic or lack. And from that place, life organizes itself efficiently. Not always comfortably, but coherently. This is an important distinction. Alignment does not mean comfort at all times. It means clarity. Sometimes clarity asks you to let go of things that no longer match your state. Sometimes it asks you to say no where you used to say yes. Sometimes it asks you to pause when you're used to pushing. But even those moments feel right, not forced, not confusing. Right, because they come from identity, not fear. The person you are being determines what feels right to do. And when that person changes, your entire experience reorganizes around it. This is why you don't need to fear losing this understanding. Once identity shifts, it doesn't snap back easily. You can revisit old habits, but they won't feel like home anymore. You've tasted what it feels like to not interfere. And once you know that feeling effort feels unnecessary, trying feels heavy, waiting feels artificial, you'll still live your life, you'll still plan, you'll still work. But none of it will feel like you're fighting reality. It will feel like you're moving with it. That's the real gift of this understanding, not control, not instant gratification, but harmony. And harmony produces results faster than force ever could. So if you're wondering what to do after listening to this, the answer is simple. Nothing. Not in a dismissive way, in a precise way. Don't add more. Don't fix more. Don't chase more. Just notice when you're trying again and gently stop. Let the system run. It already knows what to do. It always has. The only thing that was ever required was for you to stop getting in the way. And once you do, life takes over from there, quietly, consistently, unavoidably. That's why one real listening is enough. Because once understanding replaces effort, nothing else is needed. Everything you want is already in motion. And it has been this whole time. You just had to stop pushing long enough to feel it. And when you finally feel that, when you feel how little effort is actually required, something else becomes clear. You see how much energy you've been wasting trying to control outcomes instead of aligning with them. You see how often you were fighting symptoms instead of addressing the source. And that realization doesn't create regret. It creates compassion for yourself. Because you did what you were taught to do. You were taught that success comes from pushing. That change comes from discipline. That certainty comes after proof. But this mechanism doesn't work that way. Proof comes after certainty. Movement comes after alignment. Change comes after acceptance. Once that order is corrected, everything simplifies. You no longer wake up asking, "What do I need to do today to make my life work?" You wake up asking, "What feels natural to move toward today?" And that single question changes everything. Because natural movement is frictionless, forced movement is exhausting. The body always knows the difference. This is why the nervous system plays such a central role in all of this. A regulated nervous system signals safety. Safety allows expansion. Expansion allows new possibilities to register. When you're in survival mode, your world shrinks. When you're at ease, it opens. This isn't spiritual. It's biological. The subconscious doesn't create from words, it creates from signals. And your nervous system is constantly signaling whether you feel safe or threatened, abundant or deprived, supported or alone. Trying to manifest while your system is tense is like trying to receive a message through static. The moment the static clears, the signal comes through effortlessly. That's why nothing changes when you're trying to fix yourself. And everything changes when you finally stop seeing yourself as broken. You were never broken. You were overloaded. Overloaded with instructions, overloaded with techniques, overloaded with rules about how you were supposed to think, feel, and be. When those layers fall away, what remains is surprisingly simple: presence, clarity, trust, not blind trust, not naive optimism, functional trust. The kind of trust that allows you to take the next step without needing the entire path revealed. The kind of trust that doesn't rush, that doesn't panic, that doesn't demand guarantees. That trust is what Joseph Murphy was pointing to beneath the language of prayer and affirmation. Not words spoken into the void, but a settled conviction that the answer already exists and is already active. You don't pray to convince, you pray to align. And alignment is felt, not forced. This is why the most effective prayer is not asking, it's acceptance. Acceptance that the intelligence organizing your life is already responding. Acceptance that you don't need to micromanage it. Acceptance that your role is not to force outcomes, but to remain available to them. Availability is the key. When you're desperate, you're unavailable. When you're anxious, you're unavailable. When you're trying to control everything, you're unavailable. But when you're calm, open, and grounded, you're available, and availability is magnetic. Opportunities don't respond to need, they respond to readiness. Readiness is not preparation. It's internal space. When you create space by letting go of strain, things enter that space naturally. This is why people often say, "I wasn't even trying." And then it happened. They weren't trying because they were ready. Their internal environment could support what was arriving. Trying to force something before you're internally aligned often leads to outcomes you can't sustain. Even when you get what you want, it feels unstable, temporary, like it could disappear at any moment. That instability is not in the thing, it's in the state you received it from. When you receive from ownership, things stay. When you receive from lack, things leave. Because the subconscious always restores consistency. This is why the real work is never about chasing the outcome, it's about becoming the person for whom the outcome is normal. Normal doesn't mean boring, it means stable. And stability is what allows things to last. Once you understand this, you stop fearing loss. Because loss only happens when something doesn't match your identity. When something matches who you believe yourself to be, it doesn't feel fragile. It feels anchored. This is the difference between manifesting something and embodying it. Manifesting is temporary, embodiment is permanent. Embodiment happens when there is no internal argument. No part of you saying, this could disappear. No part of you saying, I don't deserve this. No part of you saying, I have to hold on. Holding on creates tension. Tension creates instability. Letting be creates balance. Balance creates longevity. So the question is not how to get everything you want. The question is how to stop interfering with the state that already allows it. And the answer is not effort. It's awareness. Awareness of when you're trying again. Awareness of when you're gripping. Awareness of when you're making your happiness conditional. The moment you notice, you soften, and the moment you soften, the signal corrects itself. No ritual required. No repetition required. No struggle required. This is why this understanding doesn't ask you to change your life overnight. It asks you to notice who you're being while you live it. Over time, those moments of noticing add up. You respond differently. You pause instead of react. You trust instead of control. And gradually, almost without realizing it, you look around and see that your life no longer resembles the one you were trying to escape. Not because you forced a transformation, but because you allowed one. This is the quiet power of alignment. It doesn't need belief. It doesn't need faith. It doesn't need motivation. It needs one thing: for you to stop fighting the present moment. Because the present moment is where identity lives, and identity is what shapes everything that follows. Once you live from that place, there is nothing left to chase, only to experience. And that's when life begins to feel less like a problem to solve and more like a flow to participate in. Effortless, responsive, alive, that's the state that creates. And once you've touched it, even once, you'll recognize it when you drift away from it. Not with judgment, with clarity. And clarity always brings you back, again and again, until living this way no longer feels like a shift, it feels like home. And when it finally feels like home, you stop asking whether you're doing it right. That question no longer makes sense. You don't ask if you're breathing correctly or if you're existing the right way. You simply are. And that's the same relationship you begin to have with your life. You stop managing yourself. You stop supervising your thoughts. You stop correcting your emotions. You trust the intelligence that's already operating through you. That's the moment the struggle ends. Not because life becomes perfect, but because resistance dissolves. You're no longer fighting the current. You're moving with it. And movement with the current always looks effortless from the outside. This is why the results that come from this state feel different. They don't shock you. They don't overwhelm you. They fit. They feel like the next logical step, even if you couldn't have predicted them. And because they fit, they stay. You no longer feel the need to protect what you receive. You no longer fear losing it. You no longer attach your identity to outcomes. You've stepped into a deeper stability, one that doesn't depend on circumstances behaving a certain way. That stability is what allows abundance, love, clarity, and opportunity to circulate freely in your life. Nothing sticks to tension. Everything flows to ease. And ease is not laziness. Ease is alignment. Alignment means you're no longer sending mixed signals. Your thoughts, feelings, and sense of self are finally speaking the same language. When that happens, reality doesn't hesitate. It responds immediately. Not because you demanded it, but because you stopped contradicting it. This is why one real listening is enough. Not because this message is special, but because once understanding replaces effort, the interference ends. And when interference ends, the system you've been using unconsciously your entire life finally works in your favor. There's nothing mystical left to chase, nothing hidden to unlock, nothing more to prove. Just a quiet, grounded knowing that what's meant for you is already moving and has been all along. You don't need to rush. You don't need to force. You don't need to wait. You're already standing where everything begins. And from here, life doesn't need to be fixed. It only needs to be lived. That's the real transformation. And once it happens, even once, you'll never relate to effort, desire, or struggle the same way again, because now you know, and knowing is enough.